They say a man can disappear without leaving town. He just needs enough years and enough silence. For nearly 20 years, Ethan Walker had lived exactly that kind of life in a narrow valley tucked deep between two low mountain ridges in the western frontier, a place where the wind moved through the grass like a slow river, and the nearest town sat almost 20 miles away down a dusty trail few travelers bothered to ride anymore. And most mornings, Ethan woke before sunrise, stepped out onto the wooden porch of his small ranch house, and listened to the quiet that had become his only companion for a very long time. Because in this valley, nothing much ever changed except the seasons and the color of the sky. Ethan owned little more than the land beneath his boots, a weathered cabin, a small corral, and two steady horses that knew the trails better than any map ever could. And that was exactly how he preferred it, because quiet places have a way of letting a man breathe without questions following him. And Ethan Walker had spent many years making sure the world had no reason to remember his name. The ranch sat on a gentle slope overlooking a wide stretch of prairie grass that rolled out nearly a mile before the land dipped toward a narrow river. And from the porch, Ethan could see almost the entire valley from east to west, which meant he usually noticed visitors long before they ever reached the ranch. Though visitors were rare enough that the sight of a rider in the distance could remain the most interesting event of an entire month. On that particular afternoon, the sky carried the pale blue color that often comes before a cold evening, and Ethan had just finished repairing a broken fence post near the corral when he noticed something unusual on the far edge of the valley. Not a single rider, not even a small group, but a long, thin cloud of dust rising slowly along the horizon where the prairie met the base of the mountains. And at first he assumed it was just the wind lifting dry dirt from the old trail that crossed the valley floor. Yet the dust did not drift the way wind usually moved it. Instead, it traveled forward in a slow, steady line, as if something large beneath it was moving with purpose. Ethan leaned one arm on the top rail of the fence and narrowed his eyes toward the horizon, watching carefully the way a rancher learns to watch storms rolling across open land. And after a few quiet minutes, he realized the dust cloud was growing wider, stretching farther along the trail than any small group of riders would normally create. And that was when a strange feeling crept into his thoughts. The kind of feeling a man gets when something from the past begins moving closer without warning. He walked back toward the porch of the cabin, resting his hand against one of the wooden posts as he studied the horizon again. And now he could just barely see the faint shapes of horses moving beneath the dust, more horses than he had seen ride through the valley in many years. And though they were still more than a mile away, Ethan could already tell there were far too many for an ordinary visit. For a long moment he stood there without speaking, the wind brushing lightly against his coat while the valley remained otherwise silent. And somewhere deep in his memory, a thought surfaced that he had not allowed himself to consider for nearly 2 decades. Because sometimes the past stays quiet only until the day it decides to come riding back. The cloud of dust continued to grow along the far edge of the valley, and Ethan Walker did not need a spyglass to understand that whatever was moving toward his land was far larger than any ordinary group of travelers. Because the dust did not rise in scattered patches the way a handful of riders would make it. It stretched across the horizon in a long rolling line that moved steadily forward like a slow tide pushing across the prairie. Ethan remained on the porch with one hand resting against the wooden post beside him while the wind brushed quietly through the dry grass around the cabin. And although the valley had been silent for most of the afternoon, something about the air now felt different, heavier somehow, as if the land itself understood that strangers were approaching. For many years Ethan had lived in this valley without interruption, and the world beyond the mountains had slowly faded into something distant and unimportant, the kind of place that existed only in memory. But the sight of that moving dust brought back an old habit he had not needed in a long time. The habit of watching carefully and measuring distance the way a man learns when he once lived a life where unexpected arrivals rarely meant simple conversation. He stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the fence near the corral where the ground rose just enough to give him a clearer view of the valley floor. And now that the riders had come closer, he could begin to count shapes beneath the drifting dust. Not 10 riders, not 20, but many more. So many that the movement of horses seemed to ripple across the prairie like a long, dark shadow sliding over the grass. Ethan rested his arms along the top rail of the fence and studied the distant line of riders for several quiet minutes. And the longer he watched, the more certain he became that they were traveling with purpose rather than wandering through the valley by chance, because their formation remained steady and direct, moving along the old trail that led straight toward his ranch. A man who spends enough years living alone in open country learns to recognize patterns in the land the way a sailor reads waves on the ocean, and the pattern Ethan saw now told him that these riders were not passing through, they were coming here. The wind shifted slightly and carried a faint sound across the valley, the distant rhythm of many hooves striking hard ground, too far away to be loud, but clear enough for Ethan to know that the dust cloud was only the beginning of what was approaching. For a moment, he considered the possibility that the riders might turn toward the river and continue along the southern trail that eventually reached the old trading route. But something in his instincts told him that would not happen, and when he looked again at the direction of the moving line, he saw that the riders were holding their course exactly toward the center of the valley, where his ranch stood alone beneath the long shadow of the mountains. Ethan straightened slowly and placed his hat more firmly on his head, while the late afternoon light began to fade into the cooler colors of evening. And although he had spent many years convincing himself that the past had finally lost interest in him, the sight of those riders moving steadily across the prairie stirred a quiet certainty in his thoughts that the quiet life he had built here might not remain untouched much longer. He watched them for another minute before turning back toward the cabin, and somewhere behind him the long line of riders continued crossing the valley floor, drawing closer with every steady step of their horses while the silent ranch waited beneath the fading sky. The riders continued crossing the valley while the evening light slowly faded into the long blue shadows that settled across the prairie every night. And Ethan Walker stood beside the corral, watching them the way a man studies a distant storm when he knows the wind is carrying it straight toward his land. By now the shapes beneath the drifting dust were clearer, horses moving in steady lines. Riders spread across the trail in numbers far greater than Ethan had expected when he first noticed the dust along the horizon. He had lived in this valley long enough to know that no ordinary group traveled with that kind of presence, because a handful of riders might pass through quietly on their way to the trading route. But this was something entirely different, something deliberate. The sound of hooves reached him more clearly now, not loud, yet but steady and unmistakable, the kind of rhythm that could only come from many horses moving together across open ground. Ethan rested his hands on the top rail of the fence while his eyes followed the slow movement of the riders across the prairie, and for the first time he began to see the details that distance had hidden before. Their formation stretched wide across the trail, and although they were still nearly a mile away, he could tell that they were not scattered travelers, but a large group riding with purpose, each horse moving in quiet coordination with the others. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and cooling earth across the valley, and the sky above the mountains turned the deep amber color that often appears just before sunset disappears behind the ridges. Ethan had spent many years convincing himself that nothing from the outside world would ever find its way back to this place. Yet the sight of those riders stirred memories that had not crossed his mind in a very long time. He remembered other days long ago when distant dust meant something important was coming, days when the world beyond the valley still knew his name and expected him to ride toward whatever trouble waited beyond the next ridge. Those days had ended many winters ago, or at least that was what Ethan had believed when he chose to build his ranch in a place where few men ever traveled. He had believed the quiet here would remain untouched, that the valley would slowly erase whatever stories the outside world once remembered about him. But now the riders were closer, and the dust cloud that followed them had grown so wide that it stretched across nearly the entire width of the valley floor. Ethan could count dozens of horses already, and as he studied the moving line more carefully, he realized the number was far greater than that. The riders were not simply traveling together. They were moving like a single body across the prairie, spreading out just enough to cover the trail while still holding a clear direction toward the ranch. Ethan lifted one hand to shade his eyes against the fading light and watched them for another long minute. And that was when he noticed something that made him grow very still. The riders were not slowing down as they entered the valley. They were not turning toward the river or the old southern trail. They were riding straight toward him. The valley that had been quiet for 20 years now held the steady thunder of approaching horses. And as the sun slipped behind the mountains, Ethan Walker understood that whatever reason those riders had for coming, it had something to do with him. The last light of the sun slipped behind the mountains while the long line of riders continued moving steadily across the valley. And by the time the sky turned from gold to deep blue, Ethan Walker no longer needed to guess how many of them were coming, because the dust had begun to settle and the riders were close enough for him to see the wide formation spreading across the prairie. He stood near the fence beside the corral with his shoulders square and his hands resting calmly on the top rail, watching as horse after horse appeared from the drifting haze until the valley floor seemed almost alive with motion. There were far more than a dozen, far more than 50, and as the distance between them slowly shortened, Ethan understood something that made the quiet evening feel even heavier than before. This was not a traveling party, and it was not a group of traders passing through the frontier. This was a gathering large enough to fill the valley itself. The sound of hooves grew stronger with every passing minute. A steady rolling thunder carried across the open land, and the horses moved with the quiet confidence of riders who had traveled many miles together without losing their formation. Ethan had seen large groups of riders before in a different time of his life, long before this ranch existed, and the sight of them now stirred memories he had carefully kept buried beneath years of silence and routine. He lifted his hat slightly and wiped a thin line of dust from his brow before placing the hat back into position, his eyes never leaving the slow, moving line advancing across the prairie. As the riders reached the lower part of the valley floor, the last of the sunlight faded completely, leaving only the pale glow of the rising moon to illuminate the land. Under that cool silver light, Ethan could finally see the riders clearly. Their horses were strong and sure-footed, moving with the smooth rhythm of animals that had crossed mountains and plains together. And the riders themselves carried the calm posture of people who were neither lost nor uncertain about where they were going. Ethan counted them silently for a moment, his gaze following the line as it stretched across the valley, and the number grew larger the longer he looked until the realization settled firmly in his mind. Nearly 200 riders were entering his valley. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself a quiet breath while the wind moved across the grass behind him and brushed against the wooden walls of the cabin. The ranch had stood alone here for 2 decades, untouched by the larger movements of the frontier, and the world beyond the mountains had rarely sent anything more than a single traveler along the distant trail. Yet now 200 riders were approaching his land, as if they had chosen this valley for a reason. Ethan stepped away from the fence and walked slowly toward the porch of the cabin, stopping at the top step where he could still see the riders clearly beneath the moonlight. The long line continued forward until the front of the formation finally reached the edge of the open ground near his ranch, and then something unexpected happened. The riders slowed. One by one, the horses came to a halt across the valley floor, spreading out in a wide silent arc that faced directly toward the cabin and the lone rancher standing on the porch. No one shouted and no one rushed forward. The entire group simply waited in the moonlit valley, their presence filling the quiet land like a question that had traveled many miles to be asked. I have learned that when many riders arrive together without speaking, it means the land itself is waiting for something to be decided. Ethan Walker remained standing on the wooden porch of his cabin while the wide arc of riders rested across the moonlit valley, their horses shifting slowly beneath them as the night wind moved through the tall grass. Nearly 200 riders had crossed the mountains to reach this quiet place, and yet none of them hurried forward or raised their voices. They simply waited in the stillness as if the moment itself carried meaning that words might disturb. The silver moonlight stretched across the prairie and illuminated the calm faces of the riders at the front of the formation, and that was when Ethan noticed something that made the quiet even more unusual. None of them looked like strangers who had lost their way. They looked like people who had come to the valley with purpose. Ethan stepped down from the porch and walked a few slow paces toward the open ground in front of the cabin, his boots pressing softly into the dry earth that had not known the sound of so many horses for 20 years. The wind brushed across his coat and carried with it the distant scent of pine from the mountains behind the ranch. For a long moment, nothing moved except the horses gently shifting their weight and the grass bending beneath the evening breeze. Then one rider near the center of the formation guided his horse forward at a slow and careful pace. The man rode calmly across the open space between the large group and the lone rancher, stopping when he reached a respectful distance from the cabin. The rider sat tall in the saddle with the steady confidence of someone who had traveled a long road to stand in that exact place. Ethan studied the man quietly beneath the pale moonlight and noticed the details that the distance had hidden before. The rider wore the traditional clothing of an Apache warrior, his posture strong and balanced as he rested both hands lightly on the saddle horn. The horse beneath him was a powerful animal with a dark coat that reflected the silver light of the moon. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The quiet between them carried the weight of years that had passed since Ethan last stood face to face with riders from the Apache people. Finally, the warrior lifted one hand slowly in a calm greeting that carried no sign of hostility. His voice was steady when he spoke across the open ground between them. He said that the valley had not forgotten Ethan Walker, even if the outside world believed the rancher had vanished into silence. Ethan listened carefully to the words while the wind moved gently through the grass around them, and he realized that the riders had not come to challenge him or force their way onto his land. They had come because something beyond the mountains had changed, something large enough to send 200 Apache warriors riding through the night until they reached this forgotten valley. And now they were waiting for the man who had once ridden beside them to decide what would happen next. The Apache warrior remained seated on his horse beneath the pale moonlight, while the wide line of riders waited silently across the valley behind him. And Ethan Walker stood several steps away from the porch of his cabin, listening carefully to the quiet words that had just crossed the open ground between them. For many years, Ethan had lived with the belief that the past had finished speaking to him, that the roads and battles and long rides across the frontier had finally settled into silence. Yet now the presence of 200 Apache warriors standing in his valley made it clear that the world beyond the mountains had not forgotten everything. The wind moved slowly across the prairie grass while the horses behind the warriors shifted their weight and breathed softly in the cool air. Ethan looked across the wide arc of riders and saw that none of them showed signs of impatience. They were waiting the way experienced travelers wait when an important moment has arrived. Ethan stepped forward a few more paces so that he stood fully in the open ground between the cabin and the rider. His boots pressed lightly into the dust as he lifted his gaze toward the man on horseback. For a long moment, Ethan studied the warrior's face, searching through the quiet memories that had rested in his mind for 2 decades. Time had changed many things in the world, but certain expressions and certain eyes remained recognizable even after many seasons had passed. Ethan finally spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly through the night air. He said that riders do not travel through mountain passes and across open plains unless something important has brought them there. The warrior listened with steady attention before nodding slowly in agreement. His answer came in the same calm tone that carried neither urgency nor threat. He explained that many winters ago, Ethan Walker had ridden beside the Apache people during a difficult season when several tribes and settlements struggled to survive the shifting frontier. At that time, Ethan had helped guide a small group safely through the mountains when others believed the journey could not be done. The warrior said that those events had never been forgotten among the Apache families who remembered that winter. Ethan remained silent for a moment after hearing those words. The quiet valley seemed to grow even stiller as the story reached across the years that had passed since that time. The warrior continued speaking and explained that the riders had come now because the land beyond the mountains was beginning to change again. New trails were forming, new settlements were spreading across the frontier, and many people were searching for safe routes through the same mountain valleys Ethan had once crossed. The Apache leaders had gathered their strongest riders to travel here because they believed Ethan Walker was the one man who still understood those hidden paths. The warrior looked across the quiet ranch and then back toward Ethan before finishing his words. He said that 200 riders had come to this valley not to challenge the rancher, but to ask whether the man who had once guided them through the mountains was willing to ride again. I left the mountains because I believed the land had finally grown quiet, Ethan Walker said slowly, his voice carrying across the open ground between himself and the Apache warrior, and for a moment the night seemed to pause while those words settled into the still air of the valley. The moon had climbed higher above the ridgeline, and its pale light now stretched across the ranch, reflecting from the wooden boards of the cabin and the calm backs of the horses waiting across the prairie. The Apache warrior listened carefully without interrupting, his posture steady in the saddle as the wind moved lightly through the long grass around them. Ethan turned his head and looked across the valley where the 200 riders waited in silence, their formation wide and patient beneath the silver sky. It had been many years since he had seen such a gathering, and the sight of them stirred memories that had remained quiet for a long time. He remembered the cold passes in the mountains, the narrow trails where only one horse could walk at a time, and the long journeys when survival depended on knowing the land better than the weather itself. Those roads had once been part of his life every season, but the ranch behind him had been built for a different purpose. Ethan had chosen this valley because it rested far from the movement of the frontier, a place where the wind and the cattle were the only things that changed with the passing years. The warrior finally spoke again in a calm and respectful tone. He said that the Apache leaders understood why Ethan had chosen a quiet life. They knew that many riders eventually put down their saddles and choose the peace of open land and steady work. But the warrior also explained that the world beyond the mountains had begun shifting again. Trails that once belonged only to travelers and traders were now being searched by larger groups looking for new routes through the high country. Some of those routes crossed lands that had been respected for generations. The Apache leaders believed that if the wrong paths were opened without guidance, many people on every side of the frontier could face difficult times. That was why they had come to Ethan Walker. The warrior said that there were few men alive who understood the hidden valleys and narrow passes as well as Ethan once had. He told Ethan that the riders waiting across the prairie were prepared to travel wherever the journey might lead, but they wanted someone who could guide them wisely through the mountains before those paths were lost forever. Ethan listened without speaking while the quiet wind moved around the cabin and across the valley floor. The request carried more weight than the warrior's calm voice revealed, because it was not simply about riding again. It was about choosing whether the past he had left behind would return to shape the future of the land beyond the mountains. Ethan looked back toward the ranch for a moment, toward the barn and the grazing pasture that had filled his days for 20 peaceful years. Then he turned his gaze once more toward the long line of riders waiting beneath the moon, and the valley held its breath as he considered whether the quiet life he had built was about to change. The valley remained silent after the warrior finished speaking, and for a long moment Ethan Walker did not answer. The wind moved slowly across the open land and brushed through the tall grass while the moon continued rising above the mountains, spreading a pale silver glow across the ranch and the long arc of riders waiting across the prairie. Ethan stood with his hands resting calmly at his sides while his eyes moved from the Apache warrior in front of him to the distant formation behind. 200 riders had crossed mountains and valleys to reach this quiet place, and their patience now filled the night like a quiet promise that whatever decision he made would carry weight far beyond the borders of his ranch. Ethan took a slow breath and turned his gaze toward the dark outline of the mountains that stood beyond the valley. Those peaks had once been the roads of his life. He remembered the narrow stone passes that twisted between the ridges and the hidden valleys where water flowed even in the driest summers. Few men had ever learned those routes well enough to travel them safely. The land was beautiful, but it demanded respect, and many travelers who entered the mountains without understanding them had discovered that the wilderness did not forgive careless steps. Ethan had spent years riding those trails when he was younger, guiding small groups through storms and across dangerous ground where the wrong turn could lead to days of wandering. Eventually, he had chosen to leave those roads behind and build the ranch where he now stood. The quiet valley had offered something the mountains never promised. It had offered stillness. But the presence of the Apache riders reminded him that the land beyond the mountains was still changing, and that the knowledge he carried had not disappeared simply because he stopped riding those paths. Ethan looked again toward the warrior waiting on horseback. The man remained calm and patient, showing the same respect that the riders behind him had shown since they entered the valley. There was no pressure in his expression and no urgency in his posture. It was clear that the Apache leaders had come not to demand anything, but to offer a choice. Ethan slowly walked a few steps across the open ground, his boots pressing softly into the dust as he moved closer to the rider. The horses behind the warrior shifted gently while the night breeze continued moving across the valley floor. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice steady and thoughtful as it carried through the quiet air. He said that the mountains had not changed since the last time he rode through them, but the people who searched for those routes had changed many times. The warrior nodded in agreement, understanding the meaning behind those words. Ethan then looked once more toward the ranch behind him, toward the barn and the wide pasture where his cattle rested under the moonlight. 20 years of quiet work had built a peaceful life in this valley. Yet the riders waiting across the prairie had traveled a long road because they believed that Ethan Walker still had a role to play beyond the borders of his land. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the warrior again and allowed a small, thoughtful smile to appear on his face as the night wind moved gently across the valley. The decision forming in his mind was beginning to feel clearer, and the riders waiting in the moonlight seemed to sense that the quiet moment of reflection was slowly coming to its end. The quiet smile on Ethan Walker's face remained as the night wind moved gently across the valley, and the Apache warrior watched him carefully from the saddle while the long line of riders continued waiting beneath the moonlit sky. For several seconds neither man spoke, yet the silence between them no longer carried uncertainty. It carried the calm understanding that comes when a decision has already begun forming in a man's mind. Ethan turned his eyes once more toward the mountains that stood beyond the valley, their tall shapes rising dark and steady against the silver glow of the moon. Those peaks had once been the roads that shaped his life, and even after 20 years of quiet ranch work, he could still picture the narrow trails winding between the ridges and the hidden streams that appeared only during certain seasons. The land had not forgotten those paths, and neither had he. Ethan finally looked back toward the warrior and gave a small nod that was slow but certain. He said that a man does not spend half his life learning the language of mountains only to pretend that knowledge has disappeared. The warrior listened closely and then returned the nod with deep respect. The message was clear even before Ethan spoke again. Ethan explained that the valley had given him 20 years of peace and honest work, and for that he would always be grateful. But he also understood that the mountains beyond the valley were beginning to draw the attention of many people who did not yet understand how dangerous those lands could become if they were crossed without wisdom. If the riders had come seeking guidance through those high passes, then they had traveled to the right place. The warrior's expression brightened slightly as he heard those words, yet he remained calm and patient as Ethan continued speaking. Ethan said that he would ride with them through the mountains and show them the routes that could protect the land and the travelers who depended on those paths. But he also added one condition. The knowledge of those trails must be used with respect for the land and for the people who had lived beside those mountains for generations. The warrior placed his hand over his chest and assured Ethan that this was the same promise carried by the Apache leaders who had sent the riders. For them, the journey was not about claiming the land, but about protecting the balance that allowed many people to travel safely across it. Ethan listened and then allowed a quiet breath to leave his chest as the weight of the moment finally settled into place. The quiet ranch behind him had been his home for many peaceful years, yet the world beyond the valley was calling him once more. He turned toward the cabin and looked briefly at the barn and the wide pasture where the cattle rested beneath the moonlight. Then he faced the warrior again with steady eyes. Ethan Walker said that the riders should rest in the valley tonight because the journey into the mountains would begin at first light. Across the prairie, the 200 Apache warriors seemed to sense that the answer had finally arrived, and beneath the calm glow of the moon, the silent valley welcomed the beginning of a new road that would soon lead far beyond its quiet borders.